Hello and welcome to Geekerati. In this short episode, I'll be doing a review of the classic 1954 Nicholas Ray film, In a Lonely Place. Let's have a conversation about it.
Hello and welcome to Geekerati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life's dilemma of the earth.
Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters.
I am Sinistar.
For a while now, I've been doing weekly classic film recommendations as a part of my weekly Geekly newsletter on the Geekerati website. But this week, I thought I'd do something a little differently. I wanted to do a video talking about the film that I reviewed earlier this week, or last Friday. Last week's film recommendation was the 1954 Nicholas Ray film, In a Lonely Place. The film stars Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Grahame and is a psychological romantic tragedy that touches on the themes of post-traumatic stress and how the suspicion of murder can disrupt a relationship. These are themes that were also touched upon by the films The Best Years of Our Lives, a film that, by the way, is obliquely name-dropped in A Lonely Place, and the Alfred Hitchcock thriller Suspicion, a film that goes a distinctly different direction than In a Lonely Place does, but has similar dramatic and suspenseful impact. In A Lonely Place, like Suspicion, is usually classified as film noir, but I'm not one who would classify either in that film genre. Film noir has some form of corruption at its core, and neither In a Lonely Place or Suspicion takes place in a world that is as morally corrupt as your typical noir classic. To me, these are romantic psychological thrillers. The effect here is to see how drama can affect the psychology of a romantic relationship. Is a romantic relationship going to survive suspicion or doubt? These films deal with issues of trust and trauma and how they affect our ability to love one another. They touch at a very different nerve than the typical film noir does. That isn't to say there aren't noir or dark elements in A Lonely Place. It does take place in the most noir city in the world, Los Angeles. Los Angeles is, after all, where the train stop ends. There is no place to go home to once you've arrived in the city. And like Sunset Boulevard, In a Lonely Place is about a screenwriter. But those are not enough in my mind to place it into what I truly think of as film noir. Then again, I think of Nick and Nora Charles and their detective comedies as film noir, and that puts me outside of most people's definition. And this is because of the Dashiell-Hammett connection, right? In my definition of film noir, it's a little bit different than most. You really have to focus on that corruption in society. It's not enough that the story elements be dark or about the dramatic elements between people, or that people are in and of themselves potentially capable of violence. What needs to be at the core for me is elements within society as a whole. You have to have that sepulcher surrounding society that shows that there's darkness within what appears to be the beautiful and elegant exterior of society. And no city in the world captures that like Los Angeles does. From a distance, it glitters. It's the shining city of stars. But when you get close, you really get to see where the corruption lies, or where that shine is not as bright as it should be. In a Lonely Place begins with our protagonist, Dix Steele, driving to his favorite industry dinner hangout. This opening scene is where we get the first glimpse of Dix's anger and his darker side. It's an anger that may be a legacy from the war, as comes clearer as the story gets more and more articulated throughout the film. But this scene is also the first place where we get to see our first significant continuity error. Unless it was common for people to just drive in the middle of the road in 1950, in which case the opening scene doesn't have anything wrong with it. But from my perspective, showing cars going two ways in traffic, then cutting to one sitting in the middle of the road somehow not getting hit, is a continuity error. Upon arriving at the restaurant, we learn that while Dix may have a temper, he is loved by many in the industry. In fact, he's even kind to those who may or may not deserve it. He's even loved by those he's slighted in the past. He's an angry man, but he's a compassionate man. And it's this combination that gets him into trouble. During the dinner, he briefly chats with a hostess at the restaurant and invites her to his home to provide him with a synopsis of a book he's been hired to adapt, but is too lazy to read. It's a perfect encapsulation of his character as a screenwriter. He's a character who wants to write something important, but is often having to settle for writing what the market demands. And that's not enough for him. It is while this young woman, Mildred Atkinson, played by Martha Stewart, no, not that Martha Stewart, is at his home giving him the synopsis that Dix meets Laurel Gray, played by Gloria Grahame, and she is fantastic in this film. She is the woman with whom he is doomed to fall in love. He soon sends the young woman away. He is tired of her synopsis. He's heard enough. She hasn't even finished the tale, but he knows where it's going. He doesn't need to read the book, and she's given him all the information that he needs. But instead of driving her home, he has her walk to the bus stop late at night, alone. This is a decision he will come to regret, as she is found murdered the next morning. Nicholas Ray does a couple of very interesting things with this scene. One of them is excellent. One of them should have been used in the mystery of the film, but was dropped. We'll call it a kind of Chekhov's scream. And one is just kind of strange. The scene where Dix wanders into his bedroom to change because he's so bored by the synopsis being given by Mildred, only to discover in opening his window the radiant beauty that is Laurel Gray is magnificent. The cinematography is great, and we follow Dix in a natural way. He sits by the window, and we get the woman of his dreams framed in a magnificent shot. It's narratively sound, and the cinematography is a delight to see. But the scene also contains a moment that made me ask, why did they drop this plot point? What is going on? This is there to be used. It is an Easter egg to be found. It is the glass slipper that should be used later on in a reveal, and it is not. Mildred, in her synopsis of the book, cries out in panic several times. She's getting carried away in her performance of the synopsis. She's just overwhelmed by this story that she thinks is amazing. But she's crying out for help in a way that might disturb neighbors, and she is silenced by Dix, who's worried what the neighbors might think. This is expressly stated in the scene, and I really wish this had come up later in the film. This was the perfect opportunity for a red herring, both for the investigators within the film and for the audience. What kind of man is Dix? How angry is he going to get in this scene, and how angry do his neighbors think he's going to be? One of the things that made Suspicion work so well is that the audience was as suspicious of Cary Grant as the characters in the film are. That kind of tension could have been played up here. It is in other places in the film, but it's completely abandoned in this scene. This likely happened in the editing bay, because I can't imagine a screenplay not including it. But I believe it was a poor choice to leave it there. Speaking of poor choices, in the middle of the synopsis, Nicholas Ray has Martha Stewart, notice I'm using the actress name and not the character, act directly into the camera as she delivers some of the details. It's a moment where we're in Dix's point of view, and we're supposed to get a sense of what he's experiencing. But the direction and the acting here is clumsy and overbearing at first. It doesn't quite work. It might work if Dix was even more annoyed by this than he was, but he isn't more annoyed than he was. And so we end up with a dissonant moment in an otherwise excellent scene that sets the stage for the mystery. And the key here is that Martha Stewart, her overall performance is very good. So this brief moment where she's talking directly into the camera, pacing toward it, and we're in Dix's POV, seems a little unnatural. By the way, did I mention that there was a mystery in the film? Did I mention that Mildred gets murdered? Well, she does, and it's in a heartless manner. A manner that makes Dix a suspect. He's given the news that he's a suspect by his friend, Detective Sergeant Brub Nikolai, who's played brilliantly by Frank Lovejoy. Detective Sergeant Nikolai had served under Dix during the war, and Lovejoy is a wonderful moral center to the entire film. He's an honest detective trying to get at the truth of the matter, no matter where that truth leads him. He's willing to investigate it if his friend from the war is guilty, and he's willing to defend him if he isn't against a system that assumes his guilt. He's willing to go either way, and he will stop at nothing to do it, all the while remaining loyal. He never lets his preconceptions, that loyalty, or those of others get in the way of his pursuit of truth. He goes where the facts lead him. He is Mr. Monk. He is Sherlock Holmes. He's that kind of character. He's kind. He's a good friend. But he's an honest broker who will do what needs doing if it needs be done. Where Dix is a character who acts rashly and then earns forgiveness or asks forgiveness later, Nikolai is a character who treads carefully. He doesn't do things at the spur of the moment. But even he might have to ask for forgiveness at the end of this film. And it may be that careful treading and that time-taking that leads to even greater trouble. I'm not going to go further into the plot, because there are some excellent twists. It's not to say that the end is a surprise. I think you might have a sense of where it's going about halfway through the film. But there are wonderful emotional twists throughout the film as the characters themselves develop and interact with one another. These are twists in the same sense as they were in Suspicion. They don't change your mind. They don't leave you guessing. But instead, they are an examination of the psychology of a man who has seen the elephant and heard the owl hoot, and who has the unseen scars that war leaves behind. I think you should watch the film already. There's so much good about it. The score is not overbearing, as it often is in some noir pieces. I won't say it's quite subtle, but it's used to good effect. The cinematography, as I said, is really good. As an older film in black and white, they do have the advantage that they get away with a lot of rear projection, but they don't over-rely on it either. And if you look carefully and you know Los Angeles' geography fairly well, you might notice what a couple of the locations are and be able to see and figure out on your own where the young woman was murdered and left to be found later. This is a film driven by wonderful performances, but without the cinematography, without that clash between the black and the white in the shadows, in the lighting and cinematography, it wouldn't work as well. I think that's why many often categorize it as a film noir film. It does use the light and shadow in a similar way, and it is black and white in an era after color, but once again, it is the romance at the heart of it that really sticks with you, and I think that it is the psychological conflict within that romance that's of interest, and not statements about the corruption of society or the corruption of the individual. That's not a part of this film, but you should just watch it already and make up your own mind.